Hello everyone, this is Mr. U.S. History, and this is Donald Trump, our 45th president, and he lost re-election in 2020 to Joe Biden, who is our current president. Donald Trump was not our first president to lose a re-election, and is most certainly not going to be our last. We have had a total of 10 presidents lose the general election in their re-election campaigns. We have also had around 4 presidents who have lost their primaries. Some presidents have lost re-election by overwhelmingly large margins, and some by narrow margins. Some presidents have also lost their primaries and weren't even nominated to make it to the general election. This all began in 1800 with George Washington. He did not lose re-election, obviously, but in 1796, he chose not to run for re-election. This led to an open field where the Federalists nominated John Adams and the Democratic Republicans nominated Thomas Jefferson. Ultimately, Adams won the election by a very narrow margin. Adams' presidency also featured Thomas Jefferson as the vice president, largely due to the fact that at the time, the runner-up would always become the vice president no matter what party they belonged to. Adams' presidency started off rough, mostly due to the undeclared naval war with the French, as well as the XYZ affair, which was an unsuccessful attempt by American diplomats to secure peace with the French, which ultimately resulted in the French demanding a bribe, which led to tons of anti-French sentiment in the United States. Adams ultimately supported a diplomatic approach to the French, while the leader of the Federalist Party, Alexander Hamilton, supported a more militaristic approach. This put Adams and Hamilton, who were already uneasy, at odds with each other. Adams was also signed the very controversial Alien and Sedition Acts, which had made it a crime to criticize the federal government. And these acts were very unpopular and ultimately tarnished Adams' reputation. Taxes had also gone up under Adams' presidency, largely due to the fact that he needed to fund the military. And this led to the Fry's Rebellion in Pennsylvania, which ultimately Adams had pardoned the rioters, mostly because he wanted to win Pennsylvania, but nevertheless, this had cost Adams significant support in western Pennsylvania. Thomas Jefferson was nominated by the Democratic Republicans, and Aaron Burr served as the Democratic Republicans' vice presidential nominee. Burr was chosen largely due to his influence in the state of New York, and at the time, the plan was for Jefferson to receive every Democratic-Republican vote, and for one elector to abstain so that Burr would become vice president rather than tying with Jefferson. Alexander Hamilton also was opposed to Adams' re-election bid, largely due to the fact that Adams had disbanded the army, which made him very unpopular among militaristic Federalists like Hamilton. Hamilton ultimately wrote a letter to the electors telling them not to vote for Adams, which ultimately hurt Hamilton among many Federalists and pretty much ended his political career, and did little damage to Adams, interestingly. Ultimately, though, Jefferson won the election by 8 electoral votes and blew out Adams in the popular vote, though keep in mind this is largely due to the fact that many New England states, which was Adams' base of support, did not allow for the popular vote. Ultimately, Jefferson and Burr tied in the House of Representatives, which led to contingent election. They tied in the general election because that one elector accidentally voted for Burr. So in this contingent election, however, Jefferson won, thus becoming the next president. Adams was bitter over his defeat and refused to attend Jefferson's inauguration. Ultimately, though, the two men would become friends again, 10 years after this election defeat. Now let's go to the next election, 1824. The incumbent president, James Monroe, was very popular, largely due to the fact that he had numerous foreign policy successes, including the Adams-Honest Treaty, as well as the Monroe Doctrine, which basically stated that the European powers had no right to intervene in the New World. It was under Monroe also that relations with the British had become better, despite the fact that we had had a war with the British in 1812. The main contenders in 1824 were John Quincy Adams, the Secretary of State and son of former President John Adams, William Crawford, the Secretary of Treasury, and a politician from Georgia, Henry Clay, a politician from Ohio and the Speaker of the House, as well as John C. Calhoun from South Carolina, who was also the Secretary of War under James Monroe. Andrew Jackson had also emerged as a candidate, largely due to his reputation as a war hero, and ultimately was widely popular due to his success in the Battle of New Orleans, an overwhelmingly large victory for the Americans over the British, despite the odds being stacked against them. Calhoun ultimately dropped out of the race, seeing that he had no chance in competing with Crawford and Jackson in the South, and became a vice presidential candidate. Jackson and Adams and Crawford and Clay ultimately all tied in the Electoral College, with no candidate getting a majority, thus forcing the election to go to the House of Representatives. Henry Clay was eliminated because he did not get third place in the House. Ultimately, Clay supported Adams, largely due to the fact that the two had similar politics, and Clay had despised Jackson, viewing him as a dangerous man and not at all qualified for the role of president. Adams ultimately won the contingent election due to Clay's support, and Adams' presidency saw mass industrialization as well as further infrastructure. Ultimately, though, Adams' presidency had gained a lot of support had built up, opposition built up due to Adams' presidency, mostly because of the Tariff of Abominations, which was a drastic increase in tariff rates, as well as the fact that many of these opponents to Adams' presidency wanted a strong executive branch because they viewed Congress as being controlled by elitists. They also had supported the rights of states over the federal government. They also thought that there was a corrupt bargain between John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay, in which Clay had bribed Adams for the position of Secretary of State so that Adams could become president and would win in the House. There was a heavy amount of mudslinging in this election, with Jackson being accused of being a bigamist, and John Quincy Adams being accused of doing unsavory things when he was in Russia. Ultimately, the swing states were New York, Maryland, Ohio, New Jersey, and Louisiana. Jackson ultimately won the election by a landslide, crushing Adams in both the popular vote and the electoral vote. Adams still stayed active in politics and became a U.S. congressman and was a staunch opponent of Andrew Jackson's presidency, as well as Jackson's supporters. So anyway, thank you guys for watching this video. Make sure to stay tuned for part 2, which will be in the description, and is going to be about the next few presidents who have lost re-election. So anyway, thank you for watching, and make sure you hit that like button and subscribe.